PapaKennMedia, and welcome to a brand new episode of Discovering Torchwood. Today the episode I'm going to be talking about, as I'm sure you know if you have seen the reaction by now, Out of Time. And let's get right into it with my favorite parts about this episode. Starting with really all three of the characters that or the new characters that this episode introduced us to, but I'll take them in order. First of all, Diane Holmes. I really enjoyed her as a character overall. Just this very strong woman, this very independent woman who didn't seem faked at all. And I mean, obviously the whole out of time aspect is something that's brought up, well, it's in the title itself. But the issues that she faces, especially when it comes to having to deal with the licensing and just the way government and all of that stuff works these days, I can see that being a realistic issue, especially given the period that she came from. Now, overall, I do think that, I do have an annoyance that basically focuses around her, and if you saw the reaction, you might know what it is, but I'll steer away from that for now. The relationship that she started with Owen, I thought was absolutely fantastic. It was, just through this one character that, came out of nowhere, or rather came out in 1953, Owen, who is this character that I have a very love-hate relationship with him, but the evolution he goes through in this episode alone humanized him more for me. And again, it's because of this one character that just popped into his life, and I could kind of tell that something was going to happen between them from pretty early on when he asks the question, boyfriend. And I was like, had it started out with husband, boyfriend, blah blah, that'd be one thing, but just straight out boyfriend. It's obvious that he has something on his mind, but at the same time, just Owen as a character did evolve some through this. He became vulnerable, which is not something that we've gotten to see very much. We've seen him distressed, we've seen him very emotional, but this is, to the best of my knowledge, the only time we've truly seen him vulnerable since the start of the show so far. Probably the only one that would come close to it would be the episode where they had that machine that would give them visions of what happened in the past. I can't remember exact. Ghost Machine, I think it was. But yeah, that's that kind of came close to it, but overall this is the most vulnerable we've seen him, and it's all thanks to Diane. And just, yeah, overall she's a great character, and I'm gonna try and not just say that over and over for the next few characters. But moving on to my second favorite part of this episode was John Ellis. And the reason why he is particularly a favorite of mine here is that while, him and Emma were definitely the two most emotionally and physically impacted by what occurred. Diane, basically, she had to cope, and she had issues coming to terms with it all, but at the same time she had Owen, which it seemingly helped her out a little bit more, or maybe it was that she was already such an independent character that helped her in that regard. But with John, I would say he's definitely one of the absolute archetypes of a character out of time. There are a lot of people that say these days, if they've lived to a fairly old age, that they've seen ages come and go. But they've had their family with them throughout all that, so even if they don't change much as a person, they still get to experience it and have those family relations that can help them sort of ease in and out of the decades and the changing of the ages. But John is clearly very I mean, he has no family left. He hasn't had the chance to sort of evolve with the time, so he's left here all alone. And then there's that scene with his son, who is now an old man with dementia, or, Alzheimer's. And it was just such an emotional scene. And you can tell that afterwards, just like, even though his son is technically still alive, he has no idea who he is. He has no idea who he himself is. Alan, the son, he doesn't know who he himself is half the time, seemingly. So, I mean, just the decision he comes to that he wants to end it in the end. It was one of those moments where it was really hard for me to, at first, be able to empathize with him, because I don't think you should ever, I don't think you should ever commit suicide, period. But if you take into consideration that people who are in pain, like terminal illnesses, like, they're basically on the verge of death, they want to go out on their own terms, I can see how, in John's perspective, his life is over. He may be able to rebuild something, or he might have been able to rebuild something had he given it more of a chance, but his entire life was gone. And the one living remnant of his life is stricken with Alzheimer's. So even if his son did recognize him, occasionally it might be just for a matter of seconds, or maybe even minutes, if he's really lucky. So yeah, I found the trials of John overall to be really interesting. Although I will say that some of the more traditional the traditional male role that he plays in this episode, it's definitely very frustrating for me, because I don't know, that kind of thing just irritates me in general. But again, in keeping in mind who this character is, it makes sense. So yeah, I just really found him intriguing as a character overall. Which brings us to my third favorite part of this episode, Emma Louise Cowell, or just Emma, so since that'll be a lot easier to say. But she, again, like John, she was heavily impacted, especially early on, by this knowledge that everyone she knew and loved is gone. It's like they've passed on. Her mother, Gwen mentions that she died at 81, but we don't know when that was. It could have been, somewhat recent, or it could have been a while back. It's hard to say. But as hard as Emma was stricken with all of that knowledge and all of that grief, and she definitely had to come to terms with it in a lot of different ways as the episode went on, she, in my mind, she was definitely the most enthusiastic for the potential that this life could hold. It's like she's 18. She has an entire life ahead of her. And so why not go to London? Why not start completely fresh? It'll still definitely be culture shock in multiple forms in the end, but at the same time, she, out of the 3 out-of-time characters, was the one that seemed to truly embrace the situation, the only one that seemed to truly be able to find potential for happiness in the cards they were dealt. And so for that, I do feel like, in this sense, Emma grew to be probably the strongest of these three. Now again, they all made their own hard decisions in the end, but just as a person, she grew from this, very timid girl who was just going to help some family that was sick, to all of a sudden being a woman ready to take on London. And I found that really powerful, and it just a really well-paced character development in my mind. Now, I know this only takes place over, the course of a week, maybe, but at the same time, you get suddenly impacted. Oh, hey, it's not 1953 anymore, it's 2007, I think is when it takes place. Yeah. It's like, that kind of leads you kind of have to immediately learn to get used to this. And she's the one that, in my mind, did so most effectively. But moving on from there, apart from the individual characters by themselves, my next favorite part of this episode was probably one of the best things about this episode overall, and it was the grocery shopping scene, where Ianto takes all three of them to a grocery store, and just everything about that segment right there. Like, you could have expanded on that grocery store scene alone and probably made an episode or a short story essentially out of that. And that these the times they came from, the fact that what was it, Emma said that her dad only made £10 a week, or was it £10 a month? I can't remember exactly, but well, as Ianto says, things are a lot more expensive now. So yeah, just that entire scene from John seeing I was going to say porno mags, but they're not really. It's more of just kind of, I haven't seen these magazines in a long time around here. Kind of like Maxim or the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition here in the U.S. Them discovering DVDs, which they completely bypassed VHS and beta tape and all that. So, that's a pretty good upgrade in my opinion. And Emma discovering all the sweets available. And as a person with a strong sweet tooth myself, I can definitely relate to her in that regard. So yeah, just that entire scene, everything about it, including the way it ends, where Diane comes up to Ianto with a pack of cigarettes and says "smoking kills." You're just like, what does that mean? Because at that point, again, it hadn't. I don't know when it sort of became more common knowledge that smoking was actually bad for you, but I don't think it came around anywhere near the 50s. So, I just loved that entire segment of the episode. But now moving on to my next favorite part of this episode, it's very simple. Oh, so very simple. But the tea packets. See Emma tearing up these tea packets and pouring the powder, essentially, into the tea kettle. And it's not until later when the girls come in that they see, oh, that's how it's supposed to be done? Okay. Because, again, they don't know. I don't know, I would have assumed that maybe the instructions would have been on the box, but still, it was one of those moments that just cracked me up in regard to the whole, going back to the name of the episode, the whole out of time element. Or characters out of time element. Now, that brings us to my sixth and final favorite part of this episode. Oh, it's when Emma meets Rhys. Oh my god. I was interested to see how Gwen was going to introduce them. But in all the possible ways that it could have happened, I never would have expected that. And the funny thing is, it's humor that's straight out of a rom-com, basically, but it works so well here. So, oh yeah, I loved that entire part of the episode. It was absolutely glorious. So those are all of my favorites. And keep in mind, although I don't have a lot of favorites here, I would say that the first three, which is Diane, John, and Emma, that really just encapsulates the entire episode. Like, basically everything that happens to them and happens with them throughout the episode is just phenomenal. So well done, really well written, and honestly pretty well acted overall. So yeah, so again, those are my favorites. Now moving on to my annoyances. Now my first one is definitely my biggest issue with this episode, and if anyone can sort of help me get a different perspective on it, maybe understand it a little bit more, I would really be happy to have that. But my first annoyance is Diane's reason for living. Not for living, but Diane's reason for leaving. Now, like Emma, with Owen's help, it seems like she has learned to adjust to life in the present day of 2007. And, there were still a lot of challenges for her, but it seemed like she was, enjoying the idea of being able to be with Owen. She even admits that she loves him. And of course, given that it was near the end of the episode, I knew something was going to happen. But I almost sort of expected, like, aliens from time coming out of nowhere or something like that. But just Diane's reason for leaving, in my mind, is just... It doesn't make sense to me. Like, when you... and I understand, again, from the beginning, she established herself as a very independent character. She likes being on her own. But when we seem to have been experiencing not only character development for Owen, but some for her as well, to just all of a sudden be like, no, you don't understand. The atmosphere and the weather is exactly as it was the day that we went through the portal or whatever. And Owen tells her, you can't go back. And she says, well, maybe I'll go somewhere else. Why? Why would you want to when you're happy? Other than plot. And that's the whole thing. If they had given her a solid reason, other than just not wanting to be shackled down, maybe? I don't know. But knowing that she can't go back to, her time, knowing that, I don't know, even if she does find the portals, God knows when she would end up, and I say when, possibly where, it's just, it doesn't make sense to me at all. So again, if anyone can help me sort of maybe understand that perspective a little bit more, I would really appreciate it, because that's the biggest issue I had with this episode, was her reason not making sense at all to me. But again, that's just me. But whatever. Moving on to my second and final annoyance with this episode. And this was one that I definitely noticed while watching the episode, during the reaction video. But I didn't really care for how they had that sort of last second repeat of scenes with all the different characters. I get that it's supposed to, or I assume it's supposed to portray how, each of these people have affected Jack and Gwen and Owen in their own different ways. I get that, but the way they did it was, I don't know, it irritated me for some reason. Like the one with John, where Jack is in the car and it's like, he has those flashbacks to what was happening, consoling John. It's like that sort of made sense. And then even with Owen, it made some sense because they went to some very important moments seemingly in their relationship. But then there's Gwen and Emma, and again, if they had shown some of the maybe earlier scenes or just them bonding overall, that would have been one thing. But they repeat a scene that we literally saw probably less than a minute prior, where she's running along the bus set waving to Emma saying Merry Christmas. And again, that's just, I don't understand why they did that. It would have been, I don't know, it should have been done a different way that just didn't feel so strange, in my opinion. Maybe that's the best way they could have, but I feel like there was a more effective way to have gone about that. Maybe just leaving the flashbacks out altogether, because this was the course of one episode. We literally saw only scenes from this episode. Had these characters been there for a number of episodes, that would have been one thing, but this is literally all from the episode we just watched, including a scene that came a minute before. So yeah, I know I'm sort of going crazy about it right now, but I do acknowledge that it's not a huge issue. It's just something that gets on my nerves. But okay, so those are my favorites and my annoyances. And actually, before, as always, please do let me know your favorites and possibly annoyances in the comments down below as well, what you think about some of mine. And well, obviously, in regard to Diane's reason for leaving, let me know if you do disagree with me on that. Let me know why, or it's like help me sort of think through that a little bit. But moving on, I do have a question for this episode, and it's simply this: will there be more episodes with time travel involved? Regardless of whether, it's an episode with a bad guy, per se, or even if it's the people of Torchwood doing some time traveling. I would love to see a little bit more of that, because, again, that's an element of Doctor Who that I really miss, and I loved getting some of it in this episode, in that we, sort of, not really time traveled with these three new characters, but we sort of got there at the end of their time travel, so to speak. So yeah, I just, will there be more time travel elements, or will it stick to more sci-fi, alien, in the present kind of stuff? But, okay, moving on from there, I do have a track of the episode, and it's one that I couldn't show, obviously, in the trimmed version of the reaction video because of copyright, but it's The Good Life by Tony Bennett. That song is just absolutely gorgeous, and I can't remember the last time I had actually heard that song, but it's just absolutely... After I watched the episode, I actually looked up the song on YouTube and listened to it a few more times, because it's just so good within the context of this episode, and also without. It's just a really good song. So, there's my reasoning. But there are also a lot of tracks in this episode, so if you have any of your own favorites, let me know what they are. Now, moving on from there, as for quotes of the episodes, all of these came from the grocery store scene, and Ianto is involved in both of them. So, the first one is when they're right after they ask about the automatic opening doors, and Ianto is explaining it to them, and Diane steps inside and says, "Bananas!" To which Ianto says, "Of course, bananas are far more interesting." It's a combination of just... it's the way he says it, really, that makes that quote for me. Really, just his entire attitude about the whole situation was just perfect. But then my second quote of the episode is a little exchange between John and Ianto in regard to the magazines. To which John says, and then Ianto replies, "There's children around. She's a children's TV presenter." I just... just such a great line. And again, it contributes to that whole, character out of time, bit of culture shock, to say the very least. It just works so well, in my opinion. And yeah, those are... I could not think of two better lines for this episode, in my opinion. I guess you could say that the line between basically what Diane tells Owen about taking off, in reference to sex, that's definitely a good one too. But I don't know if it's because of my being irritated at her reasons for leaving that maybe made me steer away from that quote, or what. But I would say that might be a runner-up or an honorable mention overall. Though it's probably the quote of the episode for a lot of people, so if I disappointed you there, I apologize. Moving on, I do have a theory before I get to my overall thoughts on this episode. And some of it, I think at least half of this theory is based in reality. Well, in context of the show. And then another is maybe more of a worry in the end. But the theory is this: Torchwood, or Gwen's life in Torchwood, is going to drive Gwen and Rhys apart. Like, it's already causing some issues, but I have a feeling that all of that is going to end up driving them apart. I don't know whether or not he will find out about the affair or not, but I just have a feeling it's going to drive them apart. They may split up. It's hard to say. And the second half of the theory is, and Rhys may die. I don't know why. It's just me thinking about different tropes within stories. It feels like someone almost always loses a loved one at some point. Especially when they go for, the more adult-themed episodes or adult-themed shows like this. So part of me thinks that, I don't know, in the end, some alien may, come and attack Torchwood, and somehow Rhys will get caught in the crossfire. I don't know, but again, that's just that's a worry of mine, shall we say. Which I like Rhys as a character. He makes me laugh. He's really enjoyable. So that's my sort of cockamamie theory, or maybe two theories, however you want to put it. But that's beside the point. As for my overall thoughts on this episode, despite my annoyances, I thought it was really well done. I thought it was one of the most solidly written episodes, I think, of this season so far. And, strangely enough, being one that doesn't have a villain in any sense. There's conflict, and you could say that John sort of acts as the antagonist at certain points when it comes to Emma. But other than that, there's no villain to the episode. It's just sort of a slice of life episode. If part of that slice of life was people from 1953 ending up in 2007. So, but yeah, just overall, I think it is an excellent episode. definitely one of the strong points of this season overall. So a huge thumbs up in my opinion in that regard. And I'm interested to see what comes next, because it looks like they call them the Weevils? Something like that? I might be getting the alien name wrong, but basically, something's going to be happening with the Weevils, since I caught just like the slightest bit of the next time on Torchwood portion of the video. But that's where I'll end it there. That's where I'll end it. Thank you everyone for joining me for this episode of Discovering Torchwood. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Let me know if you have any questions, or let me know if you missed, or rather, let me know if you think I missed anything in regard to this episode. I would love to know if, I don't know, maybe I just sort of brushed over a certain detail that you think really should have been pointed out. I, as always, would love to hear your thoughts on that. But for now, it is time to move on to the next episode, and that will be Combat. Very simple name. I wonder if people are going to fight. That may be one of the dumbest things I've ever said. And I've said a lot of dumb things. But anyway, I apologize everyone. Thank you so much once again, and I will see you next time for Combat. Until then, Allons-y!